my sister wives that I'm leaving.
It began before anyone noticed anything was wrong, before words turned into screaming matches and bonds were broken, before anything on the surface. It began before anyone noticed, something subtle enough that it escaped cameras and onlookers and even touched people closest to it. The tale didn't unfold with an immediate change. It shifted, and that transition didn't make itself known with conflict. It made itself known with absence. It made itself known with pauses that once contained reactions. It made itself known with restraint that once contained explanations. To begin with, nobody realized what it was, because they thought it was stress. They thought it was exhaustion. They believed it was just a phase they would outlive. But it wasn't. It marked the start of an end to the old story. For so long, the narrative had been contained within parameters of endurance, within the realms of sacrifice, within a loosely defined notion that survival itself meant succeeding. So as long as people were there, as long as they strived, as long as they didn't leave, everything could remain exactly as it was. But stories remain stories only if the people within them continue with their acts. And one by one, quietly within, these roles were being brought into question. The invisible shift began as soon as someone failed to explain their pain, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Clarity's declaration: if I keep explaining this, it will never change. That realization introduced the first crack in the story, because explanations had, up to then, been the binding solution. They tempered truth. They justified an imbalance. They rendered ignorance as misinterpretation. When these attributions ended, the story became less insulated. Silence stepped into the gap once occupied by justification. And silence is very detrimental to stories that emphasize control. It was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of disengagement, a function of someone not reacting as they were supposed to, not taking on emotional weight, not softening an area that might disrupt harmony. At first, this disengagement appeared as cool, but calm as a substitute for compliance is disturbing. People started noticing that there was something different about conversations. Not louder, not more intense, just shorter. Decisions were made without debate. Boundaries were drawn without discussion. Emotional labor retreated. The system did not collapse at once. It wobbled. And failing systems expose which ones were weakest. The invisible transition brought with it a confrontation not with conflict, but with reality. Reality that had existed before but had been carefully maintained with emotional labor. Reality that would remain invisible only as long as it could be borne alone. It had existed there as long as that person carried it. Once that person stopped carrying it, and everyone knew it. Suddenly, assumptions were revealed. Expectations ceased landing as they once had. The strength of emotional leverage no longer worked. Old methods of guilt, pressure, and loyalty were beginning to have limited potency. None could assign specific meaning to what exactly marked a transition. That's how you know it was a real change. The lived experience. The shift existed in tone, in posture, in presence. It existed in the refusal to hurry, to pause instead of fix, to trust instead of validate, to be instead of do. It doesn't scream, such an adjustment. It pulls back. But withdrawal affects it most, as it poses an immediate threat to a dependence-based narrative. As the shift accelerated, reactions escalated around it. Some people leaned in, reaching out to rebuild familiarity. Others leaned back, uneasy at the absence of emotional investment. Some people read it as a lack of interest. It looked more like an end. But nobody could resist it. Since the invisible movement had nothing to do with influencing others, it was about changing participation. It had always been a story that required an ongoing investment of feelings in order to be kept alive. It required reassurance. It required patience. It required someone who would be willing to believe things would get better if they just tried a little harder. It began with someone realizing that it was no longer quaint to try. It was self-annihilation. And once that realization sets in, it all falls apart on its own. But the invisible shift didn't end relationships. It made it so that some of them were dependent on imbalance for survival, some on silence, some on someone staying small. These relationships began straining almost as soon as they, not because of confrontation, due to absence, lack of overfunctioning, lack of emotional translation, lack of automatic forgiveness. The story had lost its momentum, and without momentum, there isn't a story.
The change also brought about an attitude shift. Events which were previously isolated began to fit a pattern. Actions that were once tolerated began standing out. Statements that were once valid began to ring hollow. It wasn't that the facts changed, it's that it was what the lens did. And a changed lens changes everything. The invisible shift also brought sorrow, not the loud sort, the quiet sort that comes with understanding just how long you'd been living within a narrative that never truly fit. Sorrow for so many years spent with hope, all that effort on your behalf to maintain something that could not maintain you. Nonetheless, grief failed to bring an end to the transition. It added strength to it, because grief recognized the truth instead of rejecting it. The change progressed with every act made without fear, every limit maintained without reason, every instance of peace prioritized instead. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the story began losing its hold. It could no longer demand that participation. It could no longer enforce roles. It could no longer frame survival as success. The subtle change didn't alter the story. It ended it. And it did not end with a closing chapter or a dramatic finish. It began with an awakening realization that a new story no longer fit into the old framework. Something new was emerging. Not loudly, not lightly, but undeniably. The story had changed, not because someone had fought it, but because someone had stopped living within it. But once it occurs, there will be no amount of control that can reverse it and bring back the old. The invisible transition had already achieved its task, and that was merely the start.
Once the paradigm shift had begun and grounded itself within my psyche, it didn't remain relegated. It never does. It becomes a catalyst that changes the temperature within every room it enters, not because they broadcast it, but because the rules by which they could once be reached have shifted. People have been reacting to the change even before they were able to put a label on it. They could sense it in conversations that were cut short, in answers that no longer branched out into reasons, in moments of silence that were not uncomfortable, but deliberate. The familiar moves of emotional geography were missing. Nobody was hastening to ease and unease. Nobody was oiling rough corners. Nobody was salvaging tension. The movement itself was not aggressive. It was neutral. And neutrality is very disturbing to systems based on reaction. First, it was an attempt for something to fill the gap, a silence gap, a presence gap. Others spoke more. They tried harder. They filled space with words, with judgments, with reminders of how things have always been, a reaction gap. But these answers were not forthcoming. The vacuum created a void, and a void calls on people to confront themselves. But some people leaned into it. They slowed down, listened differently, wanted to know more about their own needs and expectations, instead of just expecting someone or something else. Notice just how much they needed someone else to help make things smooth. Some people were irritated. Misunderstood as being aloof, they were seen as distant because they were set boundaries. The change in behavior was labeled as being passive-aggressive, selfish, or ignorant. But none of these names stuck, because it's not a performative shift. It was planted. The individual at the center of it all had ceased negotiating within himself. To himself, he no longer needed approval on trusting what he personally knew. And with that approval within, outside pressure becomes meaningless. It all began with some cracks appearing in unexpected spots. Events that once escaped notice were no longer missed. Those things that had once faded into a pattern were no longer overlooked. Phrases once dismissed were no longer obscure. Not pain, clarity. It aided in sharpening perceptions. And a sharper perception alters the interpretation of everything. Old ways of thinking were beginning to sound repetitive. Familiar apologies began to ring hollow. The same cycles were repeating, but now they were observable as cycles rather than as circumstance. It was possible to see just how often the same pattern followed conflict, just how similar the structure of apologies followed, just how limited promises were. The invisible movement made repetition evidence, and evidence refutes denial. At this stage, the story began losing support, not because people abandoned it on purpose, but because as a result of a loss of conviction. It becomes very hard to believe an entire story once you have caught a glimpse beyond it. Those who were still committed to the previous story began to pause. Something didn't feel right. Not wrong, just no longer convincing. There was an unexpected alignment as well. Those who had never expressed themselves so openly before were finding common glances of understanding. They didn't have to synchronize. Already they understood the same tension melting, the same weight being lifted. They were also feeling the same relief, and relief is contagious. Not everyone received it. However, some people were exposed because of these changes. Their power diminished. Their dominance began to be questioned. A loss of control began without them realizing the reasons. The buttons that evoked emotions which they previously depended on were no longer working. At least they attempted at intensifying. The sense of guilt became more. Calls based on loyalty grew louder. Threats related to consequences began appearing. But fear will only be an option if there is still fear. Fear had been made irrelevant by the invisible change. Fear had been replaced with something much more stable, trust in herself. And trust in oneself doesn't argue. It unengages. This disengagement meant no disconnection. It meant discernment. Energy was no longer given automatically. Access was no longer assumed. Emotional labor was no longer free. People had no choice but to honor them or not show up at all. This adjustment shifted all relationships. Some people were quieter, but they were quieter with more meaning. Their conversations were slower, but they were more meaningful. There were no more emotional bargains. Their relationships deepened, but it wasn't because they were easy. Their relationships were deep because they were honest. Others thinned out, not due to conflict, but due to mismatch. The old norms no longer fit. The dynamic couldn't be maintained without someone shouldering more than their fair burden. And so it faded. Not dramatically, naturally. The invisible shift also changed the perception of time. The future ceased to be something that had to be waited out. It became something that had to be designed. Options were no longer put off because of fear. Plans were made without hesitation. The presence became lighter. Moreover, due to that lightness, the old weight was conspicuous by its presence. People began realizing just how draining the story had been, just how much energy it took to sustain, just how many concessions there were to make just for it all to hold. It had been so normalized that they hadn't realized they were giving up so much. The paradigm shift changed what I considered. It proclaimed, peace requires no permission. That message shook everything. The plot had hinged on the notion that peace was contingent, that it had to be merited by patience, obedience, endurance. All that was overturned. Peace was no longer a reward. It was an average. And standards drive behavior. Some people adapted quite easily. They changed communication. They honored boundaries. They listened without being on the defense. They were capable of sitting with uncomfortable feelings instead of dumping them. But there were others. Changing the rules, they blamed on the shift. But the truth was simpler. The rules were there all along. They had not, however, treated everyone the same. The invisible transition made it visible. As the years passed, the story fell apart. It failed to explain the here and now. It failed to predict actions. It failed to govern actions. People ceased referencing it unconsciously. It ceased being cited as a reason. Soon, no one defended it anymore. And without champions, stories get lost. Not with confrontation, with irrelevance. It failed and it didn't disrupt anything. It caused differentiation. People began occupying their own space instead of merging into a common story. People began making decisions on their own. People began differing without arguing. People began relating without being obligated. It scared some people. It emancipated others. However, it had become impossible to overlook the difference. This transition had gone from invisible to undeniable. And as it grew, it uncovered something profound. It had never been a stable story. It had been maintained. It requires maintenance. It is maintained because it is. It's maintained by silence. But once that maintenance ceased, the story didn't fall apart because it was attacked. It fell apart because there were no forces holding it together anymore. The invisible shift had done precisely what shifts are meant to do. It altered the tale because it made it impossible to live with the old one. Now, it was up to everyone to make a determination about how they would carry on without it. That would set what would happen next. Because once a story loses its grip on us, something needs to fill the vacuum. And whatever will replace it will be based not on endurance, but on agility, but on truth.
By the time that invisible shift had reached this level, it had gone beyond something that could be dismissed or justified. It had transcended into an area that had consequences based on decisions that were no longer theoretical, but were instead concrete. It was at this point that the tale began to shift significantly. Because a change like this will inevitably get to a point where neutrality becomes insufficient, where remaining at status quo becomes a choice, where a life marked with ambiguity becomes unnecessary. Some people experience these forces immediately. They realize that it meant they no longer had the old flexibility to move effortlessly from role to role and from expectation to expectation. The middle ground had disappeared, and there no longer existed a way to gain from imbalance without noticing it. It required alignment, not loud loyalty, not dramatic declarations, alignment with truth. And truth is a nuisance, as it disrupts familiarity. The individual at the center of it all understood this intuitively. They didn't push people. They didn't force dialogue. They didn't make threats. They merely lived with an internal consistency. Their words matched their actions matched their silence matched their peace. That consistency became the mirror against which everyone else would be measured. People began realizing they could no longer have access to this person the way they could before, not on an emotional level, not on a strategic level, not on an unconscious level. All the shortcuts had disappeared. But some people lived up to that standard. Other people stepped back. Those who rose were met with something unexpected: relationship without obligation, relationship without performance. It would be discovered that with the absence of manipulation, trust can develop. The conversations would be slower, but more substantive. Conflicts would no longer be threatening. Autonomy would no longer be confused with rejection. It caused no destruction of closeness. It purified it. But for those who pulled back, it meant abandonment. Boundaries were seen as walls. Protection for oneself became punishment. Because they would not bend, they were seen as being left out. And it demands humility in order to adapt. The invisible transition revealed just how much about the old tale rested on hierarchy, on unspoken levels, on feelings reaching and being withdrawn based on cooperation. When that world fell apart, people who were adapted to it felt as if they were drifting. Attempts were made to regain control. It referenced history. They relied on appealings. The defendants relied on tradition. They warned about regret. None of these tools were useful anymore. Because the paradigm shift had altered the yardstick of success. The objective was no longer survival. Integrity was. And integrity itself doesn't compromise to maintain the appearances. And it's here that the weight of emotions associated with change became imperative. Those who began the change began making decisions that were previously unimaginable. Those decisions that would have caused a frenzy before are now made with composure. Not easy, but clear. It doesn't eliminate difficulty. It eliminates ambiguity. And it was doubt that had maintained the old tale. As soon as there was no doubt, fear had nothing to feed on. The future no longer felt like something that had to be carefully managed. It became something that was intentionally claimed. Plans were made that did not include a contingency plan for responses from others. Goals were set that would be beyond what had been allowed before. The shift had given permission. Not external permission, internal. But with that permission, everything changed. But others noticed it. Not confidence born from superiority, but confidence born from alignment. Confidence that doesn't need to argue or assert. Confidence that doesn't seek validation. Confidence that just is. That presence had a disrupting effect, because it showed something that had sought to be refuted by the old tale. That peace could be achieved without sacrifice. That satisfaction would not require endurance. That love would not demand self-abandon. It inspired some people. They began thinking about their own compromises, about times they had been silent for stability, about times they had diminished themselves for connection. It provided them with language. But some people were threatened. They realized that if this paradigm of reality could be made to stick, then they would be compelled to confront some realities about themselves that they were not willing to accept. Their resistance intensified. Resistance, on the other hand, emphasizes what it resists. There had been an unseen momentum at work, and momentum doesn't turn back very easily. All efforts to get things back on track the way they used to be had failed, not dramatically, but quietly. The emotional hooks were no longer catching. The guilt trips were no longer working. The fear motivators were no longer motivating. As a consequence, what was left was... And then choice becomes frightening when control loses relevance. It was then that people realized that the story they had been telling themselves no longer explained the present or the future. It no longer justified behavior. It no longer required loyalty. It no longer offered stability. It had become irrelevant. The invisible shift didn't abolish history. It repriced it. Historical sacrifice was no longer celebrated as something admirable. It was necessary then, but no longer. It recognized patterns without resentment. It recognized pain without attachment. It enabled grief to flow instead of getting stuck. And grief, given an opportunity, leads to something new. It also brought about a new form of courage, not the vocal form that defies authority, but the silent form that walks away without saying a word, not the form that requires witnesses, but the form that doesn't need anyone. And it brought about a shift in priorities. Peace became more valued than popularity. Alignment became more valued than belonging. Truth became more. The old story couldn't compete with that, because there had been something given with the old story. The old method did not. By then, the unperceived change had ceased to be unperceived. It had manifested itself in its effects. Distance that was not hostile. Independence that was not rebellious. Silence that was not passive. The change had passed the threshold. It was make or break. There was no going. But what was left was transition. The area between ends and new begins. A place that can be uncertain but honest. A place where the start of something new begins taking shape, not out of fear but out of intention. It was at this stage that it became formally genre transgressive. It had gone beyond survival. It had something to do with selfhood. And once a narrative becomes centered on selfhood, control becomes irrelevant within it. The invisible transition had reached the point of no return. That which followed would not be loud.
but it would be permanent.
By the time the hidden pivot had reached this point, resistance no longer appeared formidable. Resistance looked exhausted. That which once had felt compelling now felt responsive. That which once led events now followed them. The momentum had shifted, and everyone could sense it. The shift had become concrete. Not by confrontation, but by consistency. It is consistency that breaks resistance. Not arguments, not explanations, not demands, but just showing up the same way over and over, without reverting, without softening, without negotiating away what has already been claimed. Those who resisted began to realize something unsettling. Nothing they did changed the course anymore. Emotional appeals didn't draw engagement. Pressure didn't produce compliance. Attempts to provoke conflict landed in empty space. There was nothing to fight for. And that was the most destabilizing part. The unseen shift had cleared the battlefield completely out of sight. This is when the old dynamics really started collapsing, not because someone blew them up, but because they were no longer being fed. Systems that are sustained by emotional extraction cannot survive when the source withdraws. The person in the middle of that shift had no need to justify their distance, explain their calmness, or defend their boundaries. Every attempt to pull them back into old patterns was met with failure because the door was no longer open. Not quite slammed shut, simply closed. Others started to move into adjustment, whether willingly or not. Some adapted begrudgingly, learning how to relate without entitlements. They found out that respect wasn't optional anymore, that access required accountability, that connection required reciprocity. These relationships did not dissolve. They evolved. But for others, the adjustment proved impossible. They felt the loss keenly, not of love, but of influence. The shift had revealed the degree to which closeness had rested on imbalance, and when that imbalance vanished, so did the connection. Not because it was taken from him, because it had nothing left to stand on. This was the weird calm at the front of the transition. Chaos never really came into being as people dreaded. No dramatic implosion found its way to the company, no explosive fallout, just a regular settling into the new reality. A world with clear expectations, where emotional labor was optional, where peace was looked after. The fact that there was no drama didn't mean the shift wasn't weighted. It simply meant that it had matured. The story couldn't recover anymore because there was nothing to fix. The old story needed a version of the person that no longer existed. It required self-doubt. It required hope that things might get better. It required waiting. That was no longer the willingness that existed. The unseen shift also changed how the past was remembered. Not rewritten, but understood. Moments that once felt confusing now made sense. Reactions that once felt personal were recognized as predictable. The story lost its mystery. Because when a story loses mystery, it loses power. No longer was there a need to look at what went wrong. The question had shifted from, how do we fix this, to, why did we tolerate it for so long? That question didn't come with bitterness. It came with clarity. And clarity is the final stage of detachment. As clarity settled in, decisions felt lighter. What once felt like a betrayal now felt like honesty. What at one time felt selfish now felt necessary. What once felt impossible now felt overdue. The unseen shift had completed its internal work. On the outside, these movements were so subtle and yet irreversible. Fewer check-ins, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer attempts to manage perception. Life started to organize around peace instead of performance, and peace doesn't ask permission. Those still hanging on to the old story resorted to one last tactic: urgency. It was a warning that time is running out, that opportunities would be missed, regret would follow. But urgency only works if someone has a fear of loss. The shift had taken that fear away. Loss was no longer the worst outcome. Staying unaligned was. This was the point when the ending had finally become inevitable. Unsaid, undramatized, yet implied. It was in the air. The story had reached its natural conclusion. All conflict had been resolved and tucked away. No lesson was left unlearned. The system had taught everything that it could, and what it taught wasn't meant to sustain it. The unseen shift had achieved what no debate ever could. It had taken away participation, and without participation, no story can survive. What was left was transition. Not chaos, not collapse. Transition. Unbearably quiet is the forwards movement, gently releasing roles that no longer fit,
willingness to step into something undefined but honest. The story wasn't being changed as yet. It was the being left behind. And sometimes that's the most powerful ending of all. Because this kind of ending doesn't beg to be remembered. They free people to write something new. Only one thing remains, to make the shift visible to all, the moment when the story properly yields to what follows.
But the last phase of the invisible transition brought no proclamation. It came without warning, without fanfare, without any signal that caught people's attention. It emerged as truth sometimes does, quietly and unmistakably. By this point, all could sense it. The story no longer had any relevance. It no longer served as a determinant for actions and decisions. It no longer set the standards for acceptable and expected norms. It no longer had importance. It no longer had weight. People were not opposing it. They were not aligning with it. That's how stories really end. Not when they're challenged, when they're no longer needed. The person who brought about the change looked nowhere for endorsement. They didn't wait for understanding. They didn't need consensus. Their perspective was absolute. They went ahead without taking anything from the past, without an apology, without telling the story of their exit. It was no escape. It was evolution. And then there were others who began noticing the shift within themselves as well. The way conversation seemed lighter without the act, easier decisions without having to read reactions, the ease with which they replaced anxiety with relief. The invisible change had given them permission they didn't know they were waiting for. Permission to pick peace. Permission to take a break without feeling guilty. Since most, permission to exist without reason. Some relationships adapted and survived. Some faded away on their own, not due to resentment, but due to compatibility. What once bound people together no longer existed. And it was okay. A lack of conflict does not constitute avoidance. It was resolution. It was at this point that the story let go of its hold. The old roles began to break down. The old roles no longer existed. The old roles were replaced. The old roles were replaced because there were new roles. The roles were no longer applicable. These were not renewed. It had created something new, not a replacement story, but space. Space to decide what mattered. Space to move forward without taking old definitions with it. Space to build on connections based on mutual respect instead of obligation. It was an unfamiliar space at first, but it seemed authentic. There was no hurry to fill it, no need to start defining everything anew. The transition doesn't need answers. It offered room to breathe. And it is in breathing room that new stories emerge. But the end was not a period of closure. It was not finalized with some climax. There was no point at which it all added up. Rather, there was acceptance. Awareness that some stories will end because they have fulfilled their purpose. Awareness that sometimes growth will be seen as leaving. Awareness that peace and agreement are not synonymous. The invisible change had altered the story not by rewriting it, but by transcending it. And once that occurs, there will be no going back. The past continues. But the lessons remain. But the hold is gone. It doesn't have to be defined yet. It doesn't have to be perfect and certain and something everyone else understands. It needs only be real. The invisible transition accomplished what it has always been intended to do. It unleashed the future. And so within that freedom, a new story awaits. But no louder, no larger, no more sensational, but truer. And sometimes the truth itself can be the greatest ending.